Hey everybody, welcome to Crazy Tech Lab, and I've got a great video for you today because I'm going to be reviewing a brand new mini-itx case from Kolink. So as far as I know, there are no other actual reviews out there of this case at the moment. Kolink, a case manufacturer brand that you're maybe not too familiar with, but they're not new to the mini-itx scene. They've had a couple of other Rocket branded mini-itx cases before, with the most recent being the Rocket Heavy, which was a fairly decent effort, certainly much better than the original Rocket cases from Kolink. And that case tended to focus a bit more on airflow than they had done in the past, which was definitely lacking in the first two iterations of the Rocket. However, all of those were the standard kind of shoebox design that takes up a reasonable amount of desk space compared to what we have here today, which is the brand new Rocket Complex. So the Complex is, as you can see, a tower design, very similar to the other tower case that we've been looking at recently, which is the NZXT H1 version 2. So the version 2, you can see a review to that in a link above, or by checking out my other videos. Highly recommend you look at that one before you reach for your wallet and buy the Kolink, because they're two very similar cases, but very, very different packages out of the box. So about £150, £160 here in the UK, probably roughly the same in euros. It's not been listed anywhere yet. And in the States, I'm not entirely sure where Kolink has a distributor, but I'm reliably informed that they will turn up there eventually. So probably looking at a similar amount in terms of dollars. So a whole lot cheaper than the, what is it, £400 or so that NZXT is asking for the NZXT H1 version 2, but the Kolink is bare bones. So you do not get a power supply, you don't get an all-in-one liquid cooler like you do with the NZXT H1 version 2 and the original H1, both of which have those things inside, and they're all neatly cable tied in a way which makes, despite the fact it's a mini-itx case, it's one of the most easy cases to work with that I've ever actually reviewed, because half the stuff is already in there for you. You just need to drop in your graphics card, drop in your motherboard, connect it all up. Most of the cable tidying's done, away you go. But you do pay a lot for that because the Kolink Rocket Complex is less than half the price. So what we will be doing today is checking out this bad boy to see how it performs. Obviously, we need to do some direct comparisons as we can. Obviously, that's going to be a little bit difficult because the NZXT comes with its own cooler, so I don't really want to strip that cooler out and put it in here, because the Kolink is actually capable of housing a much larger air cooler as well as liquid cooler than the NZXT H1. So going to be some interesting mashup in terms of cooling potential. I think what I'll probably do is drop in the biggest all-in-one liquid cooler I can in here and just see if that benefits cooling, because obviously that's kind of like what you would want to do. You would want to max out the extra fan mounts that you've got in here, and it is a very, very different cooling arrangement in this case. There's more storage potential. You can house larger graphics cards and larger CPU coolers as well. Slightly bigger, as you can see here. It's about an inch or two taller, about an inch or so wider and deeper as well. So it's not the same size as the NZXT H1 version 2. Kolink hasn't pulled a rabbit out of a hat and somehow done, you know, miracles with the interior. It is a bigger case. It's very, very similar though in lots of areas. So you've got a U-shaped panel going over the top with the front panel on the top. Very, very similar, if not identical, to the H1 that we've got here. 3 metal vented panels, exactly the same as the H1, and a glass panel as well. Again, exactly the same on the NZXT. However, here you don't get the pop-off panels and those kind of things, but we'll look into that in a bit more detail in a minute. So I want to thank Kolink for sending over this case. There's been a bit of to and fro in terms of the pre-production samples that they had out there, but they've decided to wait for the final production version. I have actually had a pre-production sample with me for a while, so I've had hands-on and had a look having a look at it. Pretty impressed. And as I say, what we're doing today is doing some cooling comparisons, checking out the interior and coming to some conclusions at the end. So all that's left for me to say at the moment is please subscribe to my channel. It means a lot to have your support, and you'll be notified if you turn on the notifications when I do upload new videos like this one. Lots of new mini-itx cases coming, and system builds and features and all that kind of stuff, as well as all my usual top tier hardware reviews with processors, graphics cards and cases and all that kind of stuff. So also don't forget to check me out on social media, Instagram, lots and lots of eye candy on there on a nearly daily basis. And also don't forget to comment and like this video as well. Comments always appreciated, and I love hearing about what you guys are doing with your own rigs at home, what you think about my video, and also what you think about the product that I'm talking about. In this case, the Kolink Rocket Complex. And you can kind of hear the rattliness. That's because I've just noticed I haven't actually secured the panel here. So it's not a rickety, flimsy case. It's just me being an idiot. So anyway, let's crack on. Okay, so I just thought we'd have a quick rip around the outside of the case to see what we're dealing with here and talk about the specifications as well. As you can see, the front panel completely audio port-less. There's no audio port here at all, and you just have a single USB Type 3 and USB 3.1 Type C port. So that Type C port is full-fat USB 3.1 Type C. You'll need a spare USB Type C header on your motherboard to actually use that. And then you have a single power button there as well. There's some slight sort of rough machining around the edges here, and you can see the same on some of the edges of the aluminium panels, but honestly, from more than like a foot away, you can't really tell that that is the case. It's only when you get super close up. I don't know if I can even zoom in that far on this camera. You can probably see that there is some slight sort of imperfection around some of the edges. So other specifications then, limited to SFX and SFXL power supplies, which is not really surprising. That's kind of par of the course for most mini-itx motherboards these days. And graphics card support. Sadly, there is no full 3-slot compatibility here. There are only 2 PCI slots, so that's a little bit of a shame given the extra size of the case, but you can fit 2.8 slot graphics cards in here as well. So if you do have a large cooler on your 2-slot graphics card, chances are you'll be okay in terms of the depth. Lengthwise, there is 330mm of graphics card support, so that's a lot more than the NZXT H1, or at least a centimetre or so. But if you're gunning for something massive, then every millimetre is going to count. And that is catered for by a PCI Express 4.0 riser cable. So I don't think there are too many shortcomings with this case as far as graphics cards go. So as you can see here, we have a screw mounting mechanism. So this is a unibody, a U-shaped panel here, so it goes all the way around like the NZXT H1. Obviously screws not as great as the pop-on design that we saw with the NZXT H1, which is generally much easier to deal with, but something I do kind of like is the fact that you get a roof vent. Now there isn't a way to actually mount a 92 or 80mm fan in the roof, but at least you do get a way for air to escape out of the box. And the 2 internal 120mm fans, which we will look at in a minute, they kind of draw air in through this panel, and this is why I was why I'm a bit worried about dust ingress with this case, because these ventilation holes are pretty big and there is no dust protection on the inside as well. So probably one of the first things I would do if I was going to use this case long term would be to rig some kind of dust protection or dust filter on the inside of this panel, which should be pretty easy to do. Not magnetic, obviously, because the panel is aluminium, so it will just fall off. But yeah, I don't mind the screw construction. It kind of looks a little bit more industrial, but obviously not as clean looking as the screwless design that NZXT used on the H1. So water cooling support, we have two 120mm fans, and they obviously can make way for a 120mm or a 240mm based all-in-one liquid cooler, and with 62.5mm of space in there as well. There is obviously scope for custom liquid cooling as well, with a 35mm thick radiator and two standard height 120mm fans. Air cooling, there is a lot more clearance here than the NZXT H1. You get 110mm of CPU cooler clearance. So moving on down the specifications then, and the overall height is 448 centimeters, and width and depth are around 214, 212 millimeters, so not quite square, but close enough. I doubt any of you with OCD out there over the measurements will be worried about that. The net weight is 4.45 kilograms, so obviously benefiting from the aluminium construction there. So time to look inside now, and as we can see, we've got a very, very similar arrangement to the NZXT H1. We've got a sandwich style arrangement here, and down here you can see the 2-slot support for graphics cards, but obviously a bit disappointing because it would have been quite easy to offer full triple slot support there with a third PCI expansion slot down the bottom, but sadly this is what we will have to deal with. The PCI Express 4.0 riser cable, plenty of room sort of going round the side of the case, and something else I did like is the fact that the power supply cage, which sits up here in the roof of the case, the cables actually come out this way, so they can be fed down the outside of this panel here. So that kind of keeps the inside a lot cleaner than we've seen with some other tower designs, especially with the NZXT H1, although the H1 has most of its cables tidied out of the box, which does make cable tidying and generally installing your system quite a bit easier. We can also see here that there are screw holes for 2.5-inch SSDs, and there are 4 of them in this case, so you can fit one here, another one down here, obviously taking up a bit of that cable tidying room, but I guess you can kind of have your SSDs on one side and cables running out the other with cable routing holes there, of course. And then there are 2 more SSD mounts. If I just brighten things up for you there, hopefully you'll be able to see it, just over here and on that side as well. So not really taking up any extra space in the case, and that obviously sitting over and above your, or below, should I say, your graphics card. So that's pretty much it for the interior. As you can see down there, the motherboard, that's where that sits. And finally, then we get to the side panel fans, and as you can see, there's no dust protection on those fans at all. So slightly concerned about dust ingress through those very large ventilation holes. And here is where we've got the clearance for radiators, so plenty of room down there for a 30mm radiator, 62mm of clearance, I believe, in total between there and where your motherboard I/O tray or I/O panel will actually start down there, so that's generally where you don't want to go beyond. Plenty of space for air cooling as well, and you could of course remove one of these fans and have something very, very large in there in terms of an air cooler. I'll do some measuring up a little bit later once we've got the motherboard installed. And just one final thought is that there is enough space there for 140mm fans. I'm surprised that Kolink didn't actually offer that. That would have been just a nice bit of extra thought gone into the case, offering 140mm fan support here. Plenty of room to do so, although there's not enough room for a 280mm radiator. I just tried to fit one and it ended up fouling the power supply mount up here. So unless you mod that area of the case or have it resting into that panel below, so basically lots of modding required to fit any radiator that is larger than 240mm. One final look, something I should really do, is at the bottom of the case. So as you can see, an angled power connector for your power supply, and the cables will just run out and they can kind of filter through any of the side panels, because we've just got the case on 4 stilts here and the clearance underneath them is the same on all 4 sides. So here we are with the finished build, and this is in liquid cooled mode with a liquid cooler sandwiched in there, 240mm one from Fantex. And the main issue I had with the case, apart from the issues I mentioned with the power supply earlier and getting that out, it just being a real pain, is the fact that the power supply cables are just, it's asking too much of them basically, because the power supply cables have to come out this way. They go down the side of the case here. I'll just flip it around, down here, and then kind of into the case wherever you want. But I couldn't actually get the 24-pin ATX connector and the 8-pin CPU connector to reach if they came out this way. So what I had to do is I had to route them straight down into the case, like so. So there's the 8-pin and the 24-pin is up here. And that's kind of a bit of a shame really, because I would have preferred to have routed them through that hole over there, but there just wasn't the slack. And these are relatively long for an SFX cable. So that's kind of a bit of a shame that the case isn't otherwise designed in a slightly different way. I mean, the power supply could easily come down a bit. You can see there's a big gap there that it could have come down a couple of inches. They could have moved the motherboard up a couple of inches, maybe just raise that lower panel, although that might have an impact on other things in the case. But even so, it's kind of a real pain that the cables just, the length, that the distance that the cables are being asked to travel is just too far in this case, which is a bit of a shame. To start with then, I've carried out a couple of tests, or several tests should I say. First of all, we'll look at the Rocket Complex in air-cooled mode with a Noctua NH-L9i and comparing that to the Lianli PCQ58. And also the subsidy meshlicious as well. So now both of those other cases do not include 120mm fans. So what I've actually done is I've included some Alpha Cool Ice Cool 120mm fans, and these are fairly potent. They're about 1700 RPM. They're reasonably loud and fairly powerful in terms of shifting air out of the case. So they seem to be reasonably comparable with the ones in the Kolink Rocket Complex. First test, we'll be testing those three cases in air-cooled mode with two 120mm fans apiece to see how they actually perform. And the next test that we will be doing is the those three cases plus the NZXT H1 version 2 in liquid cooled mode. And here what I've done is, rather than taking the liquid cooler out of the NZXT H1 version 2, a much more useful test for you guys is to basically max out the liquid cooling potential with an all-in-one liquid cooler in these cases, but up to a 240mm radiator. So if a case can only have 140mm in there, like the NZXT H1 version 2, I've used 140, but all the other cases could fit up to a 240mm radiator, which I think is probably typical of what people would do. I think basically the NZXT H1 with its maximum of its included 140mm rad cooler, and the other three cases with 240mm radiators, emphasizing the maximum liquid cooling potential. And in the final test, we have the GPU temperature, which was taken with the cases in their water-cooled mode, because that's the only mode that the NZXT H1 version 2 can actually do. And this is simply the temperature of the graphics card. So in terms of the actual hardware, I've already mentioned the Noctua NH-L9i. I'm also using an Asus ROG Strix Z490i Gaming, which is the mini-itx board from Asus, along with a Core i5-10600K, because that was kind of pushing the limits of the tiny Noctua cooler, the L9i, and that was with the CPU running at stock speed. And I'm also using an AMD Radeon RX 6700 XT because in some of the tests it was still getting pretty toasty. So and obviously that's a fairly standard graphics card with two fans and ventilation mainly blowing into the case and out the rear of the card. So first up then we have the CPU Delta T in air-cooled mode, and obviously subtracting the NZXT H1 version 2 here because you can only run it in liquid cooled mode. So air cooled here with the Noctua NH-L9i, and the Rocket Complex did the best job of shoving air over towards the low profile air cooler and managing a CPU Delta T 2 degrees lower than the meshlicious and also a degree lower than the PCQ58. So not a huge difference, but any kind of small difference here is fairly significant given it's a fairly small air cooler. So if you want to maximize the air cooling, the Complex is a very good case. Moving on to the CPU Delta T in with liquid cooled mode, so fitting the largest liquid cooler I had around into the cases, and obviously the NZXT H1 Limited here at a disadvantage because you can only fit we can only use the included 140mm liquid cooler. Again, the Rocket Complex doing really well and level with the Meshlicious. But the very small vents in the roof of the PCQ58 did seem to hurt it. It managed a CPU Delta T 7 degrees warmer in this test. So the final test then, the GPU Delta T, and this was in water-cooled mode with liquid coolers installed. And the Rocket Complex, just a degree behind the Meshlicious and slightly better than the Lianli PCQ58 and 2 degrees C better than the NZXT H1 version 2. So it's a clean sweep against the NZXT H1 for the Kolink Rocket Complex. It seems to do much better both in liquid-cooled and air-cooled modes. So what do we make of the Kolink Rocket Complex then? Well, in a lot of ways, I really love this case. It's got excellent cooling. It basically beat the NZXT H1 across the board, and it was also pretty good when it came to air-cooled mode as well, with a low profile, not too a cooler, compared to a couple of other mini-ITX cases as well. So in terms of cooling, whether it's air-cooled or liquid-cooled, this is an excellent case for dealing with air-cooled or liquid-cooled or even water-cooled systems if you're going custom liquid loop, because you have the option of a 240mm radiator in here with no problems at all. In terms of the design, I actually really like it. I love the design. I love the NZXT H1, of course, but I love this case as well. I like the gunmetal grey. I like the large open mesh or vents that we've got on the side, and I like the trio of vented panels mixed in with the glass panel as well. And while the NZXT case does that, the cooling here is certainly a lot better. However, there are a few issues with this case, namely in terms of its internal design and the build quality. It is pretty rough around the edges in some areas, just in terms of the way the metal is machined. But my main gripes with it really is that it could be so much easier to work with just a few small changes. For example, if they'd used the pop-in fittings for the side panels like the NZXT case does, like the Lianli case does, that we included in the graphs, the PCQ58, they're just so much easier to work with. Instead here you've got 12 screws that need to be dealt with. Just for this U-shaped section here, you've got another 4 thumb screws on the side panel and another 6 screws for the other vented panel. And that, to me, is just hideously tedious. I mean, God forbid you do what I did and you forgot to fix something inside. I can't remember what it was now, like one of the power switch button or something like that. You've then got to undo all of those cables again to get at the inside, and that's just not what you need. You know, mini-ITX should be trying to make building inside of cases as easy as possible, and that's just not what's going on here. The power supply, again, as we saw a minute ago, those cables really struggle to reach down from its really lofty position up here. They have to then go over the top to basically follow through the cable routing channels. Even the ones that are relatively long with the Silverstone power supply that I've got, they're not long enough to do that. You have to route it through the case in front of the fans or liquid cooler, as I've got in here at the moment. And it's just a pain, you know. It's just annoying to see that that lack of forethought. And the PCI Express riser cable, obviously loose in the box, you have to fit that yourself, and there is quite a bit of pressure on that. It's not pre-folded like the Q58 or the NZXT H1 version 2 are, and they're just kind of there in there, ready and waiting to use. They fit nicely. There's no extra pressure on your components. That's definitely not the case here, unfortunately. And finally, I can always sit here, it's scratching up my table. This is, that it needs case feet, basically. It needs some sort of rubberized case feet. There were none in the box, and just having bare metal on your desk, which is kind of what this case is designed for, right? It's designed to sit on your desk, and it should be sat there and not scratching things up. There should be some rubber feet on the bottom there, like there is with a lot of other cases of this type, including the NZXT H1. So, kind of a mixed bag. Would I completely discount it? No. I think you're only going to build your case once. You're only going to have to have to deal with those issues probably just once, and that's yeah, you can't be too critical of a case in terms of the build process, I feel, because you've only got to do it once. It's nice when it's made a lot easier, and we should absolutely call out cases that do make it easy. We should also call out cases that make it a bit more troublesome, like this case does here. Apart from that, I think it's not as great as the Kolink Rocket Heavy. I think that was a much more refined case and much more akin to where it sits in the market. Here it's got some really tough competition, especially with some of the latest cases that have come out, and I'm just a bit disappointed with it, really, because I know Kolink can do better. I know they had a couple of issues with the pre-production samples, but really this is kind of down to the basic design that we've got here. So I'd like to thank Kolink though for sending over the case, and I would definitely consider it for a future mini-itx build. I've already got something planned, hopefully for the near future, perhaps with some spray paint and stuff, because I think the case really lends itself to that with the screw together construction. There are virtually no rivets in here at all, I don't think. So super easy if you want to dismantle it. But again, compared to the competition, it's just lacking that bit of design pizzazz and forethought that you kind of expect from a modern, fairly expensive mini-itx case these days. So thanks to Kolink for sending it over, and I hope you enjoyed the show. And don't forget to subscribe, like and comment. Check me out on social media, and I will see you soon. See ya.